Today on The Nation Speaks, mass protests in France and elsewhere in Europe against vaccine passports, but not everywhere. So what does dissent look like across the Atlantic? We find out. And in America Q&A, should China be allowed to host the Olympics given its terrible human rights record? Enrollment in private schools and Christian schools is way up. Our guest is crunching the numbers in Indiana. He calls it an exodus from the public school system and tells us what lies behind the trend. And proposed federal guidelines for teachers would set racial quotas for how to discipline children. Our guest from Project 21 Black Leadership Network says that would handicap teachers in the classroom. Finally, should women have to register for the draft? There's a Senate bill that would make it mandatory. In America Q&A, we ask if it's the right thing to do. Hello and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucker. Mask mandates, vaccines for children, health passports, all hot topics. In different states, we have different debates, but what we haven't seen in America are large-scale protests against these measures. There have been small local ones here and there, but nothing like what's been erupting in parts of Europe, particularly in France, where hundreds of thousands take to the streets each week to protest government overreach. Italy and the UK have also seen big demonstrations, but it's not the case in all countries, as you'll soon find out. Today we reach across the Atlantic to hear from dissenting voices in France, the UK, and Belgium. So we're joined now by Alan Miller. He's joining us from the UK, and he's the founder of the Open for All campaign and also the founder of the Nighttime Industries Association. And Alexandre Juving-Brunet, he joins us from France, a former military police officer, including working in military intelligence, and he's still a captain, a reserve captain, and now in the private sector as an entrepreneur. And we have Sam Brokken with us. He's joining us from Belgium, professor of health sciences, a public health expert and researcher. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
So the point of this discussion today is to give everybody a sense of what's been going on in Europe. We've been seeing protests in some countries, hearing a bunch of different things. We know some new laws have just passed in France. So why don't we start there? Alexandre, why don't you start us off and let us know what the situation currently is in France?
In France, the situation is very volatile because the French people is very angry facing the government and the government decisions and president decisions and also speeches because beyond the legal aspect, our presidency and also the government did not stop putting oil on the fire and trying to trigger the wrath, the anger from people, because there was much humiliation. There was much bad words from our president, and many people increasingly feel it illegitimate to be the protector and the defender of our constitution, our social contract, and our people.
Specifically, what are they angry about? What are the laws that you're talking about, and what has he said recently that so angered the populace?
The 12th of July, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, made, to my mind, a historical speech. During this historical speech, he split the French people between two parts: the vaccinated people and the non-vaccinated people. And for us, it's very important because we are the people of freedom, the human rights, the rights against segregation. And this is a basic segregation regarding health issues. So for us, it's a direct attack against our institutions and constitution.
And so what do the protests look like? We see reports about big protests on the streets in France, but can you give us a sense?
The protests in France are historical too. The majority of people taking part in the protests are the real French people. They are young, they are elderly people, they are in poverty, they are rich, they are liberals, they are communists, they are everybody. French people decided one day, it was the 17th of July, 5 days after Macron's speech, they decided to go in streets and to go on strike, not a strike, but to protest everywhere. And there were thousands of people holding the French flag to protect their freedom and to protest all together to defend their rights. And it was something very unusual to see, because many French people themselves and myself, we were believing just before that the French people did not have enough spirit or bravery to go and to defend their rights. And we are wrong, because the French people, facing these dramatic situations, took his destiny in its hands. Because the major problem around Macron's speech and Macron's decision government is they just tackle the bad subject, freedom. So it is the same with our English friends, with the habeas corpus and all of this. They just tackled the bad subject, and also inside this bad subject, they wanted to take the rights from families, from father and mother, to manage their children's life and education.
So let's move to the UK now, because there's a bit of a continuum of reactions going on here. So Alan, can you fill us in on what's been going on there?
Sure. Originally, the UK government said that it would be voluntary to have vaccine passports at certain venues. And then on so-called Freedom Day, which was on the 19th of July, a month later than when the original Freedom Day was meant to be, the Prime Minister said, you're now all free, but we're going to have mandatory vaccine passports at nightclubs and other venues with lots of people in them. This is absolutely unacceptable. We have a campaign called Open for All, where we have 1,000 of the key British operators, some of the biggest chains to the smallest independents, nightclubs, bars, restaurants, festivals and events. It's also the case that whilst the majority of the British public have been vaccinated, 85% have been vaccinated now, and we should remember that what we were told was 15 million jabs for freedom. We were meant to protect the elderly and the vulnerable. We have many more now that have been vaccinated, and they're actually trying to get children vaccinated as well now, which many are very concerned about because of the risk-reward ratio. So mandatory vaccination to enter. Now, even many people who are vaccinated think this is completely over the top. In fact, the Sun newspaper, which is a very popular newspaper with ordinary people, 93% of people said this was over the top and unnecessary. We know that vaccine passports are unnecessary, they're discriminatory, they're illiberal, and they're wrong. Show me your papers to get into a bar or a club or a restaurant. Health privacy, completely unacceptable. There's a whole range of information in the NHS app, including your ethnicity, criminal offences, alleged criminal offences, other health data. This is all entirely private. Winston Churchill got rid of ID cards in Britain in 1952. We have never voted for them. The British public do not want them. The idea that you have to show your health status to get into a bar, restaurant or a nightclub is completely unacceptable. And there is a larger border campaign going to be happening, uniting all the different sectors. And they're saying it's going to be mandatory from September, but there are going to be legal challenges, there are going to be local challenges to the MPs, and there are protests, and there are going to be significant challenges to this. They have done many U-turns already. We've seen that campaigns in schools and elsewhere, and whilst they want to nudge young people to have the vaccination, they should just try and convince them. The idea that they turn our society into a biotech, show me your papers society is completely unacceptable. It's completely un-British. It's against freedom and democracy, and it's unnecessary, and we're not going to have it.
So let me ask you, Alexandre was saying it's, people from all parties, all beliefs that are out on the streets protesting this. Do you feel it's the same way in Britain, or is it certain segments of society that are more opposed to these measures?
it's very notable that the last few protests, there are many people, hundreds and hundreds of thousands, many who have never been to a protest before of any kind. Families, old, young. There's a fury at this overreach, this overstepping of these controls, and it's just very widespread and general.
Okay, so Sam, what is going on in Belgium? I think it's a bit of a different story there.
Yeah, indeed it is. First of all, we're a smaller country, of course, not like France or the UK. So for a government, it's much easier to control. What we have seen up until today is that we only have a small percentage of the people really speaking out or speaking forward against the taken measures and the COVID passport and the mandatory vaccination, which is lying ahead of us. But in France, it's a different story. In the UK as well, there are many more protests than we have. Belgium doesn't really have a good track record when it comes to protesting against the government. There is an index which is called the Hofstede Index. Has 6 different parameters which cover cross-cultural parameters, and one of them is what we call uncertainty avoidance. And Belgium is on number 1, spot number 1, with 94%. Basically, this means that they are very willing to just follow the lead of the government. So it's very difficult for us as people with concerns or proposing alternative measures to step forward. We also see that the government is pushing a wig between, let's say, the 90% of the people who are just following the narrative, the current enforced narrative, and the 10% who are what we call more critical mass. The government is really driving a wig in between them. And the last few weeks, the tone has changed enormously from the government towards the population, really inducing fear, segregation issues, and you feel as a critical mass that, people look at you in a different manner, and this is quite frightening. Currently, none of the measures are really mandatory yet. Although we already have a COVID certificate in Belgium, I think about 50 or 60% of the people already have it. 3 ways to get one. The first is, of course, being vaccinated. The other one is having a recovery certificate that you had the disease, and then you get a 6 months period, which is totally arbitrary. In which you have the right for a corona certificate. And the third one is that you can have a short-term corona certificate with the tests, like the PCR tests or that are being enforced here. If you look at events, we have mandatory testing, or you need the COVID certificate if you go to festivals, for instance. They're also talking, like in France, to impose this in restaurants, libraries, you name it. And but there is hardly any opposing voice here. And when there are protests being organized, we end up with a few hundred people. So it's very difficult in this country to oppose anything at the moment.
Very interesting. So there's a lot of different issues on the table when it comes to all these things. We've touched on some of them. One of them I want to get to, maybe I'll just start with you, Sam, since you've experienced this personally, is censorship of views that are not supportive of the narrative. Tell us what happened to you recently, and is this what's been happening? Is this commonplace in Belgium?
Well, since the beginning of the crisis, we felt from the university perspective that only the experts were allowed to come forward in the media. With about, I think, 60 dissident voices from the academics, we tried to gather around the table and talk about the situation, and we tried to get ourselves in public debate, but we were basically left out everywhere. It was quite obvious that the government told the mainstream media not to invite us in any debate. So we had a narrative being put forward by the experts from the government, and they have this narrative going on for a year and a half now. So people don't know anything else. They'd never heard an alternative until February. Suddenly, I was invited on a national debate. And one of our leading virologists said there, well, once we have the vaccine, we can't transmit the virus anymore, so then the problem is solved, and which I contested. And this basically led to a whole a hate campaign towards me, because I was suddenly put aside as an anti-vaxxer. Next day I was all over the newspapers, and eventually this led to my dismissal at the university. Yeah.
And so, Alan, what's that situation like in the UK? Are dissenting voices, alternative narratives allowed?
Well, we've had a very strong amount of silencing and censorship. You may know that the Great Barrington Declaration, with people like Professor Sunetra Gupta, Carl Hennigan, and others, they were silenced, they were attacked. Professor Carol Sikora, highly esteemed academics, epidemiologists and virologists with different political views, because this is not about the science, this is about political decisions such as lockdowns and vaccine passports. And there is an attempt by the government to pass something called the Online Safety Bill, which is about harms online, encouraging big tech to censor even more. We've already seen that big tech has shamefully ghosted and silenced many posts on YouTube, Facebook, and elsewhere, where somebody is deciding that some types of views are unacceptable. Now, in a free society, you have to have discourse. Science cannot exist without the idea that you test these ideas out. And it's not about science, it's about political decision-making. And so free speech has definitely been one of the damaged things during lockdown and during this approach. And even the discussion around vaccine passports, it's confusing, because I myself have had the vaccine. I got it from my mum. I think for the people that should have the vaccine, particularly if they're older and vulnerable, that's very different to having vaccine passports and show me your health papers. They're two completely different things. And we need to be able to discuss openly and freely. We're at risk of, from the lockdown onwards, we're at risk of becoming more like China. We're at risk of becoming a society that you're not allowed to say certain things. You could be cancelled, lose your job. And this is very problematic. And it's certainly the case if you compare Brexit. You know, in Brexit, you had both sides of an opinion discussed all the time in the mainstream news, on broadcasting, and in the press. It has been very marginalised, any discussion or questions, or indeed, the idea that you can still transmit something when you had the vaccination and get it, although you will get less damaging health issues and less hospitalisations and deaths. It's a real problem. We must insist on free speech and robust, open debate and discussion.
Okay, and Alexandre, what's the situation in France, especially since you were framing all of this as a liberty issue?
Yes, considering liberty and freedom of speech, of movement, we are all in the same situation in all the countries facing this virus or health crisis, and after this health pass. But now many foreign countries in Europe are witnessing and waiting for, in some way, what is now happening in France. And we received hundreds, thousands of messages of people supporting from Europe the mass protest we had in France, because it was the first signal from a people that massively, as perhaps in Great Britain too or in Belgium, want to, from the streets, protect the freedom, because all the institutions, from the presidency, the government, the Senate, the parliament, and all the courts, did not protect. And it was their contract. It was their commitment to protect all these basic rights. So now the French people know that it is alone, and it has to do the job by itself to regain its freedom, and we will never surrender our freedom, never.
So that's a strong statement to make. So where do you think this is going in France?
Now in France, the forced protest, it has been increasingly higher and higher every week. We were perhaps some 100,000 the first week, and after it was 500,000, and last week it exceeded 1 million. So we were far more 1 million of protesters in France, in all the cities, and not just in Paris, all the provinces and little cities in France. The people one day just stopped the computer, they stopped their phone, and they just took their flag, and they went into the street to be there and to live really what we call in France fraternity.
So Sam, let me quickly ask you, because there's a French part of Belgium, of course. Are they learning from France? Are they leaning towards more of this type of action there?
Yeah, the French-speaking part certainly leans much more to France, and and we also feel here in Belgium that the French-speaking part is much more alive and kicking, and is trying to change the narrative and trying to come forward that they don't want these measures to be implemented, and certainly not in the long term. Flanders really keeps quiet. Moreover, Flanders really has currently an issue with free speech. Even within the population, people don't want to talk about anything else but the narrative. The narrative of the government is the only correct narrative. So if you're a bit of a dissident voice, you don't make it yourself very easy in Flanders. So I certainly hope that, and it's true what Alexander says, a lot of European countries, amongst which Belgium is one, is looking to France, and we see that they are taking the lead in these protests, which are necessary, in my opinion, to just like Alexander and Alan explained, to avoid that we get totally encapsulated within a more or less China-light version. And this is not what we want. There is, biomedically speaking, and that's more my field, biomedically speaking, there is no such reason to implement a corona certificate. It's not because you are vaccinated that you are not able to get infected anymore. It's not because you're vaccinated that you cannot transmit the virus to others. So it's more or less an uncontrollable phenomena, this COVID certificate. So I don't really see a biomedical reason using it. So I wonder what the reason is why they want to enforce it on a European level, because let's be honest, this is not just a problem from country and other countries looking at one country and following the same lead. No, the EU really proposes, and President Ursula von der Leyen said it last week, we almost reached 70% vaccination rate in Europe, but this is not sufficient. We want to go to 100%. And then I think, what's the use? And then we come back to what Ellen said, and that's my main concern. Why do we want to vaccinate children? Children are not the vector of spreading. Children are almost 0.002%. That's the ratio of children under 10 years of infection fatality rate. So they hardly ever have symptoms if they catch a disease. So why do we want to vaccinate these children? They won't protect the elderly. So if the elderly already have, or the people with underlying diseases have been vaccinated, then what is the use of vaccinating children? It doesn't add up to anything.
So, Alan, I'm going to give you the last word because we're running out of time here, but do you feel like in the UK that there's any sort of dialogue going on between people and the government? As they're listening, are they listening?
There are many ministers both in the cabinet and backbenchers and in Parliament that are very, very concerned. Within the government, many have voiced their concern that things are being rushed through. This government is not strong, it's weak. it is actually erratic and defensive, and therefore can sometimes be even more terrifying with just imposing measures. But they do U-turns, and they're going to have to stand down on this. I would also like to say I spend quite a considerable time in New York, and it's one thing to ban smoking in parks, which had no real epidemiological reason for it. It is quite another to be saying that one of the great cities that never sleeps, in the land of the brave and the home of the free, that we should be showing COVID passports to get in. I personally will never go to any more establishment if that's the case. We'll meet at friends' houses and in parks. It's pantomime, it's draconian, and it is utterly wrong. The president was actually right when he said that there would be no vaccine passports federally. Some states have obviously made the right decisions, in my opinion, like Florida and Texas. It's not to do with the culture wars. It's absolutely not. It's to do with being free and sensible and calm. And this is a terrible moment for New York. And I would encourage all our New Yorkers, we're all New Yorkers, we're all French, we're all Belgium, we're all British. Anyone who believes in freedom stands together on this and does not allow this pernicious attack on us.
All right. On that note, we shall have to close up. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you.
Coming up next, why private schools and Christian schools are attracting new students in droves. But first, the Olympics is scheduled for Beijing in 2022. But given the regime's horrible human rights record, should China have the honor of hosting the Olympic Games? That's what we ask people across the country in America Q&A.
Negative. Any country that behaves towards its citizens the way China does or Nazi Germany did doesn't deserve to be part of the world community, period.
I don't think they deserve that honor. And I don't think that with what's going on in the world that's the best place to host it.
The John Travolta actually went to China one time and one time only. What does that tell you?
I think these are two different areas. It should not be mixed.
Yes, because if we're ever going to interact with China, that's one means. But you got to lay down the ground rules.
Every money that every federation will send to the Olympic Committee that will go to China, it will feed the Communist Party.
I don't see why not. The U.S. has a long history of human rights abuses too.
I'd rather not.
I think it's a welcoming idea.
That should be up to the world to decide. Me, myself, I mean, my opinion of it really does do nothing.
If they find that it is right that they are having those kind of abuses, they shouldn't.
Religion abuse, everything that we are against as Americans, the answer is no.
Maybe that would bring them more into the 21st century.
No, I definitely don't.
We have a certain standard in this country, and we ought to hold other countries to similar standards.
I don't think they should be allowed.
They should respect human rights.
China? Who wants to go to, I mean, it's a repressive country, isn't it?
No, I don't think it's ethically, morally the good thing to do.
I don't think so.
The Olympics is basically distracting you from everything else that is going on in their country, which is not okay.
No, that people should be limited to something is not something that I would say the Olympics kind of stands for.
I don't think it seems fit to host the Olympics at this time until those issues of the human rights abuses are addressed.
No. As a nation should take a stand to say no, we're not going to be a part if they're allowed to host an Olympic.
I don't think them not participating in the Olympics is enough for them to stop. I think China's very strong-minded, and something like that they probably don't care about. They're going to do what they're going to do.
The Olympics itself might be something to use to cover up this issue, and I think we need to spend more time on the real issue, which is the rights of U.S. And Chinese citizens.
The last school year was a disaster for many families. Kids were isolated at home, logging into Zoom classrooms, or they joined on site but were faced with weird new realities like face masks and plexiglass framed desks. Many parents also became aware for the first time what their kids were actually being taught. So with Labor Day around the corner, it seems some parents are making different choices. That's according to our next guest, who's been looking at enrollment numbers, specifically in Indiana. He says private schools and Christian schools are gaining students at record rates. We're joined now by Tony Kinnett. You are a curriculum developer, educator, and STEM coordinator in Indianapolis, Indiana. And you're also the founder of Chalkboard Review, an education publication giving parents a window into children's education. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So you've been crunching the numbers on school enrollment, and the numbers that you're seeing in Indiana are pretty interesting with respect to enrollment in Christian schools. You're here to share that with us. I know your report isn't out yet, so we're getting a bit of a preview on it, but can you tell us what is it that you're seeing?
The numbers are unreal. There's a pretty common fluctuation in regards to enrollment in private schools and public schools. The numbers go up, the numbers go down, usually by about 5 to 10 in a lot of smaller Christian schools. But this year, the numbers are up in many cases by hundreds per school. In one case in Greenwood, Indiana, the school has jumped almost double the number of students in attendance. It's wild. There's not really any other word for it.
So what do you think accounts for this?
Oh, well, a multiplicity of factors. Parents are really upset with a huge number of things going on in our public schools. They're upset with the quarantine that caused a huge learning gap in schools in the last year and a half. They're aggravated with critical race theory, social emotional learning. They're aggravated with children being required to wear masks regardless of vaccination status. All of these small issues have piled up and really put so much pressure that it seems this dam is bursting. And we see all of these small private Christian parochial schools growing by leaps and bounds, so much so that many of these private schools have to send messages to parents saying, we cannot accept any more students at this time. There's simply no more room.
Wow, and are these numbers just since COVID, or you've been looking back a few years, right?
So there's been kind of a steady incline over the last 5 to 7 years in some of the Christian and private schools that I've looked at. In some environments, especially in a lot of the bigger city Catholic schools, in Indianapolis, for example, there has been kind of a slight decline, but even those schools since COVID are starting to climb wildly in enrollment numbers.
And I saw from one of your tweets that you were saying it's suburban Christian schools that are really leading the way in all this. Why do you think that is?
Oh, well, I mean, there was this idea that inner city schools were kind of the worst of the public school sector, and that's kind of been a prevailing idea in the last couple of decades. However, it's amazing to see this kind of suburban shift away from these inner city schools and the public schools that are instructing their children and doing really quite a poor job of it, moving their kids into the closest option that they can find that's going to educate their children efficiently and effectively.
And so the numbers you've been looking at are specifically Indiana. Can you say anything about the trends nationwide?
Absolutely. The reason that I'm focusing this study on Indiana is first because I live in Indiana and I have a good relationship with a lot of schools in the state. Second, there are tens of thousands of private and Christian and other parochial schools nationwide. This would be an incredibly extensive study if I were to do this nationally. We might be looking at doing studies on other states. Indiana is kind of a good crossroads cut of the country. It's a good way to get kind of the initial data out to a lot of Hoosiers and people locally in the Midwest and nationally to get a broad picture on really what we've seen in a lot of schools around the country is this huge exodus towards Christian and private schools because the public schools just aren't cutting it anymore.
So do you think this also represents any turn to more religious, a desire for religious education, or is it just an alternative to the public schools?
I think that it's both, honestly. There's been quite a hunger in the United States over the last couple of years for a return to a solid moral structure, a solid community foundation, returning to some of the things that make the United States a phenomenal nation, which is heavily influenced by the faith aspects that bind us all together. I think there's a yearning for that. I think also in a lot of public schools, there's not a good emphasis on character building. It's all about what the children want and what they feel and how they're choosing to express themselves. Whereas classical education, often through a religious lens, shows students that they have a responsibility to better themselves and reach out to something higher. Also, I think that public education has proved to be such a dismal failure in the last decade that parents are simply looking for an alternative. So it's a yes to both.
Are you talking to parents as well, or are you just seeing high-level numbers from schools?
Oh, I've talked to probably about 50 parents in the last week who have expressed all kinds of sentiments of why they're leaving public schools for private and Christian options. And that's where I get all of the reasons that people are fleeing public schools to some of these limited seats in Christian schools. They're not plagued with the same kind of critical race theory, social emotional learning, all of these strange mandates, all of the weird new indoctrination principles that are really quite overwhelming in public education.
Do you have any anecdotes you could share with us from some of these conversations?
Oh, absolutely. I was talking to a parent from northern Indiana whose child was asked to identify his pronouns at age 7. And it really confused the young man. So he came home and he asked his dad what all of this was about. The parent, very upset, really enraged at kind of the stuff that's going on, found out that it was a national trend through our site, the Chalkboard Review, that's publishing all of these stories nationwide. And as quick as he could, moved his son to a Christian school in Lafayette where he's presently attending. And that's going on all around the state and from what we can see around the country.
And do you see that there's any movement of people wanting to run for school boards, or are they just bugging out entirely?
Oh, absolutely. One anecdote in particular, in Indiana, there are several different group structures of parents within multiple different kinds of counties in all different kinds of precincts, townships that are forming together to select school board members that will be running against many of the incumbents in the next couple of elections. And the amount of vetting that's taking place in the forum of what should be done in the school board, what should be done in hiring superintendents and school staff, as well as in Indiana, the school board does have authority over the curriculum in the schools. It's really incredible to see how many people are finally getting involved in school board elections beyond its traditional view as just a popularity contest.
Is there anyone else that you're aware of that's doing either the kind of research you're doing or research that adds other pieces to this puzzle to see if there's, you know, sort of a change, a sea change going on or anything else like that?
Absolutely. And we see a lot of think tanks, a lot of institutions that are putting a lot of effort into kind of painting a clearer picture of what's truly going on in the education landscape, which you're not seeing in many education publications like Ed Week that are only kind of pushing one kind of a view, or maybe teachers union publications such as the AFT. Where you are going to get a more clear view of what's really going on in the country are through institutions like Cato, the Heritage Foundation, Manhattan Institute, Fordham Institute, as well as through the great work of people like Corey DeAngelis, who are really striving as hard as they can alongside us at the Chalkboard Review to give parents a crystal clear, without distortion view of education so they can make the right choice for their families.
So a lot of those institutions or organizations that you mentioned are on the conservative side. Do you feel like there are parents that, you know, maybe aren't Republicans or conservatives, but are actually starting to get concerned and are also making these same kinds of moves?
Oh, not just parents, but teachers as well. There has been this incredible shift. I just wrote a piece for the Daily Caller about this recently, about how the next big shift away from the Democrat Party is probably going to be through teachers and parents in education. And that's because this group that's felt pandered to for so long is quite honestly sick of it. Now, I think the right has a responsibility to reach out to these groups in conservative and libertarian circles, but they're so aggravated with the lackluster way that they've been treated that they're honestly just looking for the agency to do what it is that they feel is best. And that's no longer what the Democrat Party is pushing within education.
So you've got to wrap up, but do you see also a trend of teachers moving to Christian schools?
Oh, it's incredible. I hear in teachers' lounges all over the country when I'm speaking to teachers, when hearing them talk about their conversations, how if there was an opening at a certain private or Christian school, they would leave their post in the public school immediately to take that. Teachers all the time. I hear that they want to start their own schools. They want to get out of this school board run nightmare that they're in that won't let them teach in the ways that they've traditionally taught that have really worked at educating our students for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Wow, very interesting. Okay, we're out of time, but thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.